guys, welcome back. Well, today we're very lucky to be joined by Ed Jackson. So to give you a little background for those of you who don't know, on Saturday the 8th of April 2017, Ed underwent an operation to repair a fracture of his C6 and C7 vertebrae sustained while diving into a shallow pool, and has been resurrected in the ambulance 3 times on the way to hospital. Some experts said he may never walk again, but he is an inspiration to so many. And today he is doing challenges for all sorts of charities. So we're very thankful for him to giving up his time. Ed, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Pleasure to be here. Sun's out, which is makes a nice change for the last month or so. So feeling pretty upbeat.
Definitely. So I mean, obviously, as long as you're happy to talk about, I think we'll start with your injury. And can you tell us a little bit about that day?
Well, do you know what? It was pretty much like today. It was the first sunny day of the year, but it was a bit warmer than it is right now. As you said, it was in April, so I was recovering from a shoulder injury from when I was playing at the Dragons at the time, and I'd had another shoulder op. So I was sort of laid up from that, waiting. I wasn't going to be fit until the following season. So I went back home for the weekend to my parents' house near Bath. Obviously, because it was hot, went round to our closest friends with a swimming pool, as you do. And effectively after lunch, went down to the pool, dived in to what I thought was a deep end. Turned out to be the shallow end. It was like a feature pool, so it wasn't that obvious. And what I thought was a couple of meters deep only turned out to be a lot less than that. Hit my head on the bottom. Didn't lose consciousness, but knew something was wrong straight away. I'd never really banged my head that hard. But it was when I tried to swim to the surface effectively that I realised something was seriously wrong because I couldn't move. So I dislocated the bottom of my neck, as you said, and that had left me paralysed from the shoulders down. Luckily, my dad was in the pool, and one of my mates pulled me to the surface. And that marked the end of my rugby career and a long journey of sort of recovery and a lot of change over the last 4 years.
Completely. And obviously, so starting from the beginning of the rehab process, how important was it to try and stay positive and try and like look at the benefits of what could happen in the future? So important. I mean, obviously all of these, with these injuries, like a lot of it is mental. Obviously, if a physical thing happens to you, but if you want to recover to any degree, you need to have a positive mindset. Having said that, it's really, really hard to stay positive when there's so much uncertainty about, like, I didn't know whether I'd ever be independent again, whether I'd ever walk again. And after like a week, I still hadn't had any movement or sensation return. So I was still a category Asia A1, which is at the highest level of spinal cord injury, and things were looking pretty bleak. But a few things happened like in that first week. I think if I was to sort of sit here and say, yeah, I knew I was going to get better and I was staying positive from the start, I'd be lying. I had pretty dark thoughts and it was a pretty scary time. But I kind of moved my focus off myself and onto my wife and my family and the people that were going to eventually have to look after me for the rest of my life if I didn't become independent again. And then it wasn't just about me anymore; it was about them too. And that sort of gave me the motivation to, really push hard. And a couple of days later, my toe wiggled, and I'd been told that was never going to happen again. So for me, then all bets were off, and we could just push as hard as possible to see how much could return. But staying positive, it was difficult at times. But at the same time, there were other moments where I was improving. I was back in a sort of physical challenge, which is what I was used to as a player. Like I'd recovered from lots of injuries before. Obviously, this one was a bit more serious, but every day I was like setting myself these challenges of try and move your little finger a little bit more, and a lot of the time it was really hard to do that. But when I did, it meant so much more than anything I'd won before or played before, done before in my rugby career or at school and things like that, that I was getting these little wins every day. And it felt amazing. And actually, in a weird way, I quite enjoyed a lot of my recovery, even though there was still a lot of uncertainty involved about whether I'd ever walk again. Huge amounts of it was taking on physical challenges and seeing if you could overcome them, which is kind of what I get my endorphins from,
And so you said the milestone thing where you achieved a small thing and then you celebrate it, and achieved a small thing and celebrate. And you mentioned it perhaps it correlated with rugby. Was there anything else that sort of came from your rugby sort of experience, or sort of the mindset that you acquired from being a professional rugby player to your journey?
I think playing rugby professionally, or playing rugby at any level, instills a certain level of like discipline. And if you want to succeed at it, you have to be disciplined in your training, in your, even on the way you act on the field. And I think that applied a lot during my recovery. I had to do things that I didn't really want to do in terms of training. I had to dig in through the boring times. So I knew the only way to get results at the end of the day, a lot of the time, was through hard work. But the other things that really helped was I think you develop, especially playing professional rugby for a long time. And I was lucky enough to play professionally for 10 years. You develop a certain level of resilience because you're used to not winning every week. You're used to injuries. You're used to not being selected, not getting new contracts, and getting knocked back isn't an abnormal thing for a professional sports person. And you deal with, you kind of, if you don't get yourself to a position where you can brush yourself up and off and get on with it, then you're never going to succeed in sport, because inevitably you're never going to have it your own way the whole time. So I think when those days came where I didn't push as far through as I thought I would, or I would stagnate, or I'd have a rough night's sleep, I was probably able to put it to the back of my mind a little bit quicker because of that sort of training of that mental training of just the ups and downs of professional sport. And then the third one that really helped from rugby was actually my mates, because there's a certain level of dark humor that's involved in rugby teams and rugby clubs and amongst rugby boys that actually was really important mentally, because everyone's there, your mum's there worrying, and everyone, a lot of people are like, oh my God, are you all right? And I'm lying in bed, and I'm in a massive ICU bed where there's machines bleeping everywhere. I've got tubes in my neck. Like, it's pretty graphic stuff. And most people come in and are like, oh no, you're all right, and all this sort of stuff. And you understand why they're like that, because they're looking at something pretty drastic and they don't want to say the wrong thing. But if anything, it kind of makes it feel worse than it already is. It's already bad. Whereas your rugby mates will come in and immediately start taking the piss out of you. I remember one of my mates gave me 3 juggling balls when I was completely paralysed from the shoulders down for something to pass the time. Most of the boys would end up just coming in and eating all the food that was brought in for me, because I was being fed by a tube most of the time. But people kept bringing chocolates, and what do you take to someone who's in hospital? But I couldn't eat it. So eventually I noticed that actually the circle of players that were coming through were getting more and more tight 5 front rowy, because they knew there was just a hamper full of food at the end of my bed that I couldn't eat. So but no, there's lots of things that I'm very grateful for having been involved in rugby circles for my whole life, and I think it's benefited me massively with my recovery from my own physical sort of where I was physically when I got injured. So I was always already carrying a lot more muscle bulk than a normal person. So my neck was stronger. It also meant that when I couldn't move for 3 months and I atrophied, I still had some muscle left afterwards to work with to get stronger again, all the way to like the mental side of things, which I talked about, the resilience and the dark humor. But now, after I've left this, the rugby community is amazing. Like the support I've received from not just my old clubs, but other clubs that I used to play against, and players that I don't even know, retired players, supporting me and the charity, and also the charities that are involved, Matt Hampson Foundation, Restart, who I'm now a trustee for. It's a very great. I feel very privileged to be involved in the rugby community, and when something like this happens, it very much is a, if you're involved with rugby, they talk about the rugby family, and it is one big family, and I really felt that support.
Mm. And obviously, so you wrote a blog the whole way through your recovery, I think you used an Alexa to record voice memos, so obviously you weren't writing or typing. Was that something that sort of you just wanted something to do every day, or was it sort of a mental thing that really helped like keep your mind busy and to try and keep like moving forward, I guess?
Yeah, it's a good question, because it's morphed a bit. Like originally I started it because I wanted something to
offload my thoughts for the day so that I could go to sleep. And that's why I was talking to Alexa, because obviously I couldn't move. And I'd just talk about what I'd done during the day and what had gone well and what had gone badly. And Alexa was transcribing it into notes. And then after 2 or 3 weeks, I woke up, one of my mates had read all of the notes, obviously, as your mates do. It was private, but not anymore. And he persuaded me to make it public, because I wasn't one of those people who like put myself out there. I didn't really I probably posted once on Instagram in my life before that point. Fair to say it's a lot more now. But, he said, look, a lot of this stuff is about living in hospital with an injury, and if other people go through that, this could really help. So on that premise, I couldn't really not. So I started putting it out there, and I was ignoring the responses. I didn't want to see what anyone was saying, because again, being a young bloke, but being a proud bloke and being a rugby player, you're kind of brought up to show no weakness. And I was finding it hard to be vulnerable. I didn't want to know what people were saying, but then my wife forced me to look at the responses, and it was amazing. And very quickly there was like 10,000 people reading what I was writing every day, whether that be about bowel and bladder care or spasms I was having, or what people had done during the day, and really innocuous things. But I think people were just interested in what goes on in someone's head whilst they're going through a life-changing incident. And then it became more of a, right, I'm helping people. And then actually it morphed into people are helping me, because people were getting in contact with me who'd been through these things before, and were offering me advice and a shoulder to cry on, if you like, but a lot of the time, because I didn't want to be honest with my mum and my family, and a lot of the time how I was feeling, because I already felt guilty enough for what I'd put them through. So I wanted them to put across that impression that I was absolutely fine. But of course, you're not always absolutely fine. But if it's a stranger and someone who can relate to you, then it's a lot easier to talk to them. And once you do talk to them, you realize you feel a lot better. So it was helping me as much as it was helping other people. And then since I left, I've just found the writing I never thought I could write. And I still don't really, I still can't really write very well. But even my English teacher wrote to me whilst I was in hospital, a really funny letter. He just basically said, great that you're doing what you're doing. And he was like, I just never knew you were actually listening in class. I think a lot of people don't realize they're capable of doing things until they give it a go. So now I enjoy writing because of that, the creative practice in itself. I think it's quite a rewarding thing to do. It helps me think. So if I've got an idea about something and I start writing about it, those ideas will start exposing themselves and unwinding a little bit more, and then you go off down a different path. And a lot of the time I don't even know what I'm going to write about when I sit down, and then you just put pen to paper, and things start happening. Sometimes good things, sometimes bad things, more often than not bad things, but every now and again it helps you work through your thoughts. And to the point now where I don't think I've actually said this publicly yet, but I've got a release date for a book I've spent the last year writing, which is coming out in August this year. So luckily I was lucky enough to get a book deal just before lockdown happened and coronavirus happened. So I've had a lot of time on my hands to do some writing. So I'm excited to put that out there. And that's basically just tying in all of my blogs and also filling in the gaps about the things that I wasn't talking about, because I didn't want my family or friends to read it and to upset them. So it's just about the journey of someone going through a life-changing injury, a life-changing situation, but also the journeys of the other people around them, because obviously these things affect your friends and family just as much as they affect you. So yeah, it's scary. I mean, I can't believe as of August, I'm actually going to be an official author, because it's weird how life twists and turns, but that is one thing I would have 100% said I was never going to be if you'd asked me when I was 18 or 19.
And I know you're as soon as that happened, you're very keen, and obviously it was going to affect your life, but try and not keep going the same as usual, but to try and keep moving forward in life. And obviously I think you got married while you're still recovering. How important was you to try and keep going?
Yeah, I think progress is one of the most important things that we can all have. I think, especially for our mental health. I mean, for the charity I've got now, progress is one of our 3 Ps, and it's important to be progressing in something. And I think the last year or so, with coronavirus, a lot of the reasons people have been struggling is that well, first of all, the that feeling of uncertainty, so not so knowing what's happening in the future, that is what brings on anxiety. But the other one is that sort of not feeling like they're progressing in anything anymore. And it's why people, even if they're earning 200 grand a year in the city, but they're getting up every day to do the same thing, often end up feeling, struggling mentally because they're not progressing in certain areas. And the same applied for me. I got knocked back to square one, if you like. And for a long time, I felt completely useless. Like I was even having to be fed, like washed, people help you go to the toilet, all of these sorts of things. So as soon as actually I started taking control back of some of those things and felt like I could move forward in a positive way, and actually that probably came from when I started writing the blog, because I then started feeling like I could actually help people and there was some good coming from this situation and not just bad things. And that feeling became quite addictive. But at the same time, I was going through a life-changing injury where I was having to deal with it mentally, but also physically. So hours and hours of physio every day. And a lot of the time it's hard to sort of see the future, if you like. So if I was injured from a rugby match, I could pick a game or a season to go for. And then I would know that after 6 months, 9 months of doing this rehab, I would get there. Whereas it's very different with what was going on with my injury. It was kind of uncertain how long I'd have to do it for, probably the rest of my life, but where I would end up. So having those goals in place to work towards and keep the progression going, whether it be the wedding was obviously a massive one for me early on, just being able to walk down the aisle. I know it's the bride that walks down the aisle, but I didn't want to just be sort of propped up at the end and then she has to walk off without me, or having to literally like wheel me back down with her. And I wanted to give her the wedding that she'd always dreamt of. And fortunately, so that was a massive motivating factor for me. And now moving into what I do with the mountains and the challenges, that's one of the main reasons I do it is for myself, actually, to put a line in the sand and something to progress towards. Otherwise, it's why people, put themselves out there to do a marathon a lot of the time and things like that. It's to motivate themselves to keep progressing with their sort of everyday tasks. And that's where I am at the moment.
And that's sort of a perfect way to segue to sort of, you're exploring at the moment. So a year after your injury, you obviously climbed Snowden, which was an incredible achievement given sort of the severity, and it's quite amazing. So, and you mentioned that you did it for yourself. So I was wondering, like, how did you transition between sort of being in a hospital bed and playing rugby before that to sort of climbing mountains? Was this something that you enjoyed when you were younger, or?
I've always been a bit of a country. We lived in the country. I'm not a city boy, but at the same time, I'm not like a mountaineer. I think before, apart from skiing, the biggest mountain I'd climbed was probably Snowden. So, like pre-accident when I was able-bodied. And the reason it came about was for all those reasons I just mentioned. I wanted to set a goal for myself. So it'd been 9 months since my accident. I was still in and out of a wheelchair, but I was doing hours and hours of physio every day, but didn't really, and I was losing motivation, to be honest, because I felt myself losing motivation because there was no end target to aim towards. And so I set Snowden, I said to my physio at like 12-month mark, I want to do something. I want to set an example to everyone else who's in hospital, who's been given a guarded negative prognosis, that maybe they can overturn that and do something, that they were told they can't. But also raise money for all the charities that had supported me, mostly Restart. By that point, I wanted to pay them back for they'd basically funded my physio since I left hospital, which was unbelievable and made such a big difference. So I wanted to repay them, but then also to set myself a target so I could keep sane during physio. So I set myself a target of climbing Snowden. And I thought, seeing as it's I'd finished playing in Wales. I love Wales, and also it was achievable. I say achievable. I mean, at the time, my physio said I was mad when I said I was going to do it, and he thought I was actually planning for the year later, so a whole year afterwards. But I was adamant I wanted to give it a go, and I opened it up to anyone who wanted to come and join in. I expected a couple of people to turn up, but actually I turned around on the start line and there was 70 people there who'd come to support, and they all had their own stories, and it took 9 hours to get up there, and it was probably the hardest thing I'd ever done. But I remember standing on the top and just thinking, wow, like I never thought I'd feel this way again, like feel like I'd actually achieved something and overcome something. And it wasn't because I'd climbed Snowden. I mean, I'd run up there before when I was able-bodied, but it would have been the full year of going from being completely paralyzed and told I was never going to walk again. And I just thought about all the people that had helped me, how lucky I'd been at every point along the way, and then stood on top of a mountain. All of a sudden, next thing I know, it'd gone by like that. Like the year had gone by so quickly. In some ways, the longest year of my life, but in many other ways, the quickest year of my life, because I was just so focused all the way through. And next thing I knew, I stood on top of this mountain in North Wales. Unbelievable day, like until we got up towards the top, and then the clouds rolled in. But there were 70 people there who had come to support me, and I was just like, this is amazing. And I was hooked. I was straight away, where's the next mountain? What are we doing next? And unfortunately, Restart had an Alpine Challenge going on anyway, so it wasn't long before we were in the Alps. And the strange thing is, I've sort of become this disabled mountaineer, if you like, which is, I mean, climbing mountains is probably the last thing I should be doing functionally. Swimming, rowing, any of those things, even cycling to a certain extent, I would be better at. But I think it's because it's so hard, and there's something about being out in the mountains, and there's something about standing on top of a mountain with other people and the journey to get there, that is quite spiritual for me. And I'm not really a spiritual person. I wasn't before, but I am now to a certain extent. And that some of the relationships I've made, out there, and some of the stories that I've been told, and how much it's impacted my mental health throughout this process. I can't imagine being in the position I am today without stumbling effectively on climbing mountains with the Snowden challenge. But I think it's something I'm not going to look back. I'm not going to look back from. If anything, I'm looking to go higher and higher, and we'll see how far it takes us.
I mean, it's quite staggering to hear. And obviously, you suffer from, if my pronunciation's wrong here, do correct me, Brown-Séquard syndrome, which obviously limits the movement. How did that affect your training? Because obviously, any mountaineering challenges, you need to train for it.
Yeah, so I'm still very much disabled. I've got Brown-Séquard syndrome, which effectively one of the bits of disc between my vertebrae, when my disc, the impact was so hard on the top of my head, the disc exploded, and there was sort of blew across my spinal cord and cut my spinal cord in half. So Brown-Séquard syndrome is only suffered by about 1% of spinal cord injuries. It's usually caused by stab or gunshot wounds. So it's where half of your spinal cord's been cut clean in half. Mine was caused by a shard of disc. And it means I've got poor motor function down one side, being my left side, and then poor sensation down the other side. I won't try and explain it if people are listening to this, because you have to kind of point it out, but it's because your motor nerves come down one side and your sensory nerves come down the other side, then they cross over, and my injury was above the level when they cross over anyway. It means that I'm affected with my movement. Obviously, I have one strong side, one weak side, and also I'm still affected in every other way that spinal cord injured people are, or people with neurological injuries, and it's not often talked about, all the bladder function, bowel function, sexual function, all of the spasms, temperature regulation, all of those things, because obviously neurology controls your whole body, and actually those things affect my day-to-day life way more than the fact I limp around. So I still have to use AFO, which is a foot orthotic, to lift my left foot up, because I've got foot drop on that side, and then the weakness in my core and arm and hand impacts me a bit. But I'm just so much further on than I was ever supposed to be in the first place. And it's funny, because actually, if someone told you you're never really going to be able to use your left hand again for the rest of your life, if someone had told me that before my accident, I would have been absolutely devastated. I'd been like, how am I going to live with one hand? But now the fact my left hand doesn't really work really doesn't bother me. I just call it my strong hand, and then get on with it with my other hand, because it's in context of what's happened. I came to terms with the fact that I was going to be in a wheelchair for the rest of my life. I just wanted to be independent. And by independent, I mean being able to use my arms, feed myself. But I thought I was going to be in a wheelchair. I didn't even think that was an option. So the fact that I'm stumbling around every day actually makes me happy. And that's just because of a perspective shift. And I think that's affected the rest of my life as well, really appreciating the things I'm able to do rather than being annoyed at the things that I can't. and that's certainly, you know, an outlook of mine that's changed massively compared to what it was pre-accident.
I think you just taken my next question. So I've got a quote from you. It says, "My life seems a lot better now than it was before. Not physically, there's still loads of issues, but mentally, I'm way happier day to day." I think you sort of sum that up as that you've got to only live once. You got to take what you can and just keep moving.
Yeah, I think a huge amount of that is perspective. Realizing how lucky I am to just have food on the table, and the fact that I can breathe for myself. And I now know people who can't breathe for themselves and will never be able to limp up to the top of a mountain. And, you know, having that perspective and that reality check, I think, is really important for people, because we get stuck in our own bubble and we end up only looking up and looking at what people have got that we haven't got. And it just ends up annoying you the whole time, rather than realizing how good your own life is and all the things you have. You know, if you've got a loving family, friends, food, just food on the table, and education. You know, half the people that, you know, I go to Nepal a lot now, I'm lucky enough to, and a lot of them, you know, they struggle, you know, up in the mountains, you know, they struggle to put food on the table sometimes, and they literally haven't got 2 coins to rub together, but they're happy because they don't want for anything. And I think it's really important. I think that's why I say that I'm more positive now than I was before, but also I'm doing these amazing things. I'm very lucky to have fallen into working on the media side with rugby. So that filled a lot of holes for me, staying in contact with a lot of my friends and still keeping my foot in the door with the sport. And also it's a new challenge, you know, doing TV and live TV and stuff is just as nerve-wracking as running out of Twickenham. So that's a nice new challenge, but also through the charity, you know, I feel like I've got way more purpose now in my life than I ever did. I'm in a position where I can actually positively impact other people's lives, and through the charity we are starting to really do that. And it makes me think, well, shit, if I hadn't dived into that swimming pool, then all of these amazing things wouldn't be happening, and you know, my life wouldn't be benefiting others in the same way that it is. And I see that as a real privilege, and the inspirational people that I've met along the way, and there's just so many positives to be taken. And I think when something like this happens to someone and you go through major trauma or you have a major loss, sometimes it can readdress the way you look at life, and you notice the positive things rather than dwelling on the negative things. And I think as a society, we're a bit guilty of doing the exact opposite. You know, you just have to look at the news at the moment to realize that everything is negative, and people love to talk about how terrible every decision the government's made is, or how useless, you know, whatever. You know, it's just, there's no one saying, well, actually, we're amazingly lucky, and we've had all this extra time with our families, and look at how these communities have pulled together, and look at the fundraising that's been done. And it's just not focused on. And I think for some reason, it's a pretty known fact. Like when people go through major trauma, there's something called post-traumatic growth. A lot of the time, you have 2 types of responses. You have, I mean, I'm going into a bit of psychology now because it's what I'm interested in post-accident, just trying to unpick my brain and other people's who've been through it. And you either have, after the accident, you either have passive victims, which is the people who think that things happen to them and life's not fair, which is a completely normal way to think. Or you have active agents, which is like, well, this has happened and I'm going to try and move forward and focus on the positives and see what I can deal with. And you can move from one to the other. But I think if you don't know which one you're going to be, whether you're going to be a passive victim or an active agent until something actually happens. And I think if you'd asked me which one I would have been, I would probably have said passive victim before. But it's amazing what you can deal with when your back's against the wall. And I think what's going on in the world at the moment has shone a light, I think, a lot on society and on individuals, and just the way people have reacted, whether that some in amazing positive ways, some in amazingly negative ways. But actually, as a whole, you can tell that we focus on the negatives more than the positives. And everyone's seen this as a massive negative the last sort of year and a half. And of course it is in a lot of ways, but it could have been a huge positive as well if we were willing to look at it that way. And some people have, a lot of people haven't, but it just shows you that the way you look at the world, it's not necessarily what happens to you, it's how you respond to it and the way you see that thing that's happening to you that really matters.
And and I mean, that's fascinating. You actually sort of almost answered my next thought or question I had in mind, which was sort of I've heard and read a lot of a lot of people who go through sort of these life-changing events like you, they sort of look at their life in sort of different chapters, and after the event it's sort of a new chapter and it comes with a new set of opportunities, like you said, and perhaps you have to define the word enjoyment or what you enjoy differently. And I guess that's something that you could sort of relate to massively.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one thing it's taught me is change is good, as long as you're the type of person who's can deal with change. I mean, a lot of people, it's human nature to be scared of change. Like we don't like it, and I think because it exposes us. But actually, all of the good things that have happened to me have come after changes that were out of my control. So, for example, originally, I signed for Bath after I left school, and it was my hometown club, and it was a dream come true. And I was captaining, England under-18s at the time, and my career was going one way. And then I had 2 shoulder injuries in a row, missed a year and a half of rugby, and actually ended up getting released and signing for Doncaster. Now, at that time, I thought that was the worst thing that could have possibly happened. I'd gone from my dream hometown club. I was having to move away from home to Doncaster, of all places. And actually, I went up there and I ended up having the most amazing time playing every week rather than holding tackle bags all the time. And it moved me on as a player more in that year than it had the previous 3, and set me off. And then the next year I signed for London Welsh and we won the championship, first time the club's ever done it. So this supposedly negative thing, I decided to go up there, pull my socks up and just try and turn it into a positive. And I think we can all make that decision. And a lot of things happen in life after. A lot of change always brings around opportunity. It's just whether you're able to see it or not, or whether you're willing to see it or not. Because most of the time, when something happens, change happens, people bury their head in the sand because they don't want to expose themselves. But actually, I would argue the opposite. You should go looking for change, and you should go looking to put yourself in those vulnerable positions, because that's where the good shit happens after those things. Normally, in my experience.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, we're going to move on to something else now. It's a good mindset. It's an interesting concept we haven't really thought about before.
Alrighty, guys, it's that time again. Time to pay for the pints.
Today's podcast has been brought to you by our mates over at Team Blazers. A big shout out to them, the great British Blaze company, kidding you out for every match day social. Check them out now. But now, so looking more, the first lockdown, some people learned to bake banana breads, but you decided to climb Everest. I mean, in a way, can you tell us a little bit about that?
So it was first lockdown. I was bored, as we all were. So about 3 weeks in, when the novelty had worn off, and I work quite closely with a number of charities now, and one of them in particular, Wings for Life, a spinal cord injury research charity. They had one of their main fundraisers cancelled, as most charities had that year. And I wanted to do something to try and help. Apart from just cheering Captain Tom on from the sofa, I thought I need to actually pull my finger out and do something. And obviously he had the whole wandering around the garden thing locked down, so I couldn't copy him. I couldn't compete on that front. So I just thought it'd be a laugh to go and try and climb my parents' staircase to the height of, well, the original plan was Snowden, to symbolise my first mountain, but also to make it realistic. But then I found out my mate was climbing Mont Blanc, so I was like, the height of Mont Blanc, so I was like, got competitive and immediately said Everest, which I regretted halfway through day 2, considering Snowden turns out to be a lot shorter than Everest. Snowden would have taken me about 6 hours. Everest took me about 4 days, 12 hours a day, 5,500 flights of stairs. Originally, I'd set the goal of raising $2,000. But luckily, because everyone was bored and had nothing to do and was spending time on their phones, and we were doing a lot of it across social media, it kind of got a bit of attention, and we ended up raising over 50 grand for Wings for Life and for the NHS. And it was good. It was entertaining, but at the same time, it was the most mind-numbing thing I've ever done in my life, because normally you in the mountains and you've got people to talk to and things to look at. And for me, it was just the corridor upstairs over and over again. Luckily, though, there was a fridge at the bottom of every lap that I did. Normally, you don't get that in the mountains, so I was keeping very well hydrated and fed the whole time. But we had a laugh with it, and most of it was actually a lot of the reason we did it. So we did some Instagram lives over in the morning at 8 o'clock, and then in the evening at 6 o'clock. And the reason we did them at those times was just to give people a break from the news if they wanted to. So we would go on Instagram Live, we'd get people to come on and chat with us. We had like Haskell come on and DJ, and just like we were messing around and having having fun with it. And I just wanted to spread a bit of positivity instead of everyone, including myself before, who was just waiting to hear the death toll at 6 p.m. And then everyone was wondering why they were feeling shit about themselves. And it was because of that negative input. And your brain's only got a certain amount of cognitive space, bandwidth, if you like, to deal with things. So if you fill it with negativity, there's not going to be as much room for positivity. But during negative times, if you fill it with positivity, naturally you're not going to have as much negativity in there. So there was that goal as well, which ended up being quite funny. Ended up like actually at one point doing an Instagram live with one of my mates, and then all of a sudden Joe Wicks called in, which was a bit of a shock considering he was at the time in the middle of his like PE with Joe Wicks, which is absolutely massive. So yeah, it was good fun. And I think and another example, I always talk about turning negatives into positives and opportunities and adversity. So in a way, I feel like if I hadn't done something during lockdown, everyone would have been like, well, you've got to practice what you preach. So it turned out to be a good thing.
I mean, talking about practicing what you preach, I think you really committed to it as well. I think I read somewhere that on the final day you got up at 4 a.m. to make sure there was still frozen snow at the summit. How important was it for you to make it as realistic as possible? I mean, within the circumstances.
Well, yeah. I mean, the funny thing was after I finished, I did a couple of interviews, and they were like, "Well, now you've done the height of Everest. Are you more confident that one day you're going to be able to do the real thing?" I was like, look, I don't know much about mountaineering, but I do know that there is no comparison between your parents' staircase and the real Mount Everest. Like, I don't have to spend a month at base camp for a start, and it's not -20. But it was more to have fun with it. I camped in a tent at the bottom of the stairs, and then on summit day, you always end up leaving at like 2-3 in the morning, always with a head torch on, because you want to get up to the summit and back down before midday, before it heats up too much, because then becomes an avalanche risk and all of those sorts of things. So I just wanted to make that realistic as well, but it was more to do with the narrative of having fun and spreading some positivity, basically.
And obviously it was all for charity. I think you raised £40,000 by the end of the day. Looking at charity, obviously Restart's in particular, that's had a massive effect on your life. Just how good are these charities supporting rugby players at the moment?
Yeah, they're great. I mean, so supporting rugby players in particular. So, I mean, I'm involved with a number of charities. You've got spinal cord injury charities, which are naturally I lean towards because I've had a spinal cord injury, so I could probably have more impact there. And there's some amazing ones like the Matt Hampson Foundation do a lot of work within sport and spinal cord injury. And then you've got like Backup Trust, Wings for Life that I mentioned before that I'm ambassador for, who are actually Red Bull's partner charity. Well, they're Red Bull's charity because the owner of Red Bull's godson broke his neck in a motocross accident sort of 10 years ago. So they're looking for a cure. So they're amazing as well. And then rugby wise, I work with Restart, and there's some other great rugby charities like the Injured Players Foundation that looks after all rugby players. But then Restart looks after the professional players in England, men and women, all the Premiership players in England, men and women. So they looked after me and sponsored my rehab afterwards. And yeah, the support for professional players is really good, but at the same time, we're really struggling as a charity at the moment because for the same reasons all charities are. But actually more to do with the fact that most of the support that we give to the Premiership is around mental health and confidential counselling, and there's a lot of stresses involved with playing professional sport. The demographic of being young blokes is the most affected demographic by mental health, and of course without the fundraising, and the other thing about mental health, most of it's confidential, so it's very hard to raise money for a lot of the time if you're not talking about specific cases. So we're actually in a bit of trouble at the moment, surprisingly enough, to be able to continue all the services with the hit we've taken with COVID. So yes, although there are specific charities that are there to look after professional players, also they've been impacted in the same way all the other charities have, and they aren't as big as your cancer charities or your all of your environmental charities, or they don't have the big cash reserves that those charities do. So, but then we always find that they're amazingly well supported by individuals because naturally, with the way rugby is, especially in England, in the UK, you often get people who have been to it's predominantly, especially in England, a private school sport, university sport, and then you end up with people in positions of influence at companies and organisations that can support charities that have an interest in rugby, and that's just luck of the draw, really. So a lot of the time, the support comes from them as well.
I mean, everything that you've done for charities is quite staggering. And I remember watching it, and when you've been recognised now, I think you were an unsung hero for BBC Sports Personality. What were your emotions towards that? Was it nice to be recognised? Was it a surprise?
Yeah, it was a complete surprise. My missus had been scheming behind my back for the previous 3 weeks to sort it out with them, and apparently I was completely oblivious to it. She was blatantly lying to my face like every day, but I put it down to trust. That's what I told her. I was like, I just trust you loads. She was like, you just don't care what I say, do you? I was like, no, it's not that. But yeah, I mean, it was weird. It was actually really emotional because there's some of the obvious stuff that I do through my charity and the other charities that I support, but a lot of the time I spend the vast majority of my time in terms of charitable work or support work, I spend speaking to individuals who are going through something similar or their families. And that is just something I like to do in my spare time because that's something that people did for me. And I think it's really important and really powerful. And I get a lot from those people as well. And that's something I never really talk about. And then there's no need to talk about it. I get a huge amount from it. Anyway, and hopefully it can help people in the same way it helped me. So for some of those people to come forward and talk on the BBC and for it to be recognised was amazing, but at the same time quite surprising, because I think a lot of these things that you end up doing, if I'm completely honest with you, I do a lot of this stuff because it makes me feel good. And I think if people said otherwise about a lot of charity work, well, charity just wouldn't exist if it didn't make people feel good. There's something really rewarding about going and doing something for someone else and making someone else feel better. And often doing that, if you do it seriously, unselfishly, outside of, the public giving donations, I did this, cutting a ribbon, having your statue outside something you've paid for, is still great because it means that thing's being paid for. But actually doing things that are completely off grid and for yourself, they seem to hit home a lot more with you and the person you're doing it for. And that's why I do it. And I would never want any recognition for it. So it was a complete shock because to me, it's just something I enjoy doing rather than something that I seriously feel like I go out of my way to do.
Wow. Well, we're coming towards the end of our podcast and we've got sort of 2 more questions. So I guess the most appropriate one is, what's next for you? What's sort of the next chapter?
So this year, we have a lot. I'm just hoping for a successful year with the charity, to be honest. So we're running 4 trips. We've got 1 to the Alps, 1 to Iceland, no, 2 to the Alps, 1 to Iceland and 1 to Nepal, and a 5th trip down in Cornwall as well. And it looks, thanks to the announcements, that they're all going to go ahead as planned. And we're taking our first 8 beneficiaries away on those trips this year. So going to start really helping people. I had this sort of dream 2.5 years ago, and sort of this year it becomes a reality, which is great. I mean, we ran trips last year, but this is the first year we're really going to be helping beneficiaries. So I just want a successful year with that. And then on a personal level, I'm climbing Mont Blanc, hopefully in September, and then going out to Nepal, as I mentioned before, to try and climb a 7,000 meter mountain, which will be by far the highest mountain I've climbed before. So that's the personal challenge that I'm taking on. And then at the same time, hopefully, if it all goes ahead as planned, I'll be out in Tokyo for the Paralympics, working with Channel 4 as well, which will be a lot of fun. And then I've got a podcast coming out next week and a book coming out in August. So yeah, lots of things to look forward to.
Wow,
Very
yeah. Well, we also ask all our guests sort of their favorite moment in their sort of career, and I guess for you it's sort of an extended career perhaps. What's sort of your favorite moment throughout sort of your life, I guess?
In terms of do you mean rugby career?
No, sort of anything.
Wow. Most of my favorite moments have probably come ironically since my accident. I think my highlights really, I think, from pre-accident would be from rugby. I can say that because I got married after my accident, so it's a safe one to say. But yeah, getting picked for England for the first time under 16s, getting my first contract with Bath, when I was 17, just knowing I was leaving school to do that. And then winning the championship with London Welsh was an amazing experience, given that it was a group of players. We were really the underdogs, and it was a group of players that a lot of them never thought they would ever play Premiership rugby, and then all of a sudden the next year they're playing against Exeter and Saracens, and it's that was a lot of fun, like great fun bunch who I'm still friends with a lot of them. Living in Cardiff was another highlight. Love the Welsh, love living in Wales. And then wiggling my toe for the first time was probably the biggest moment of my life, to be honest, symbolically, because what it meant. Getting married was amazing, especially given what we thought was going on. You know, there's a lot of times I thought that I would never get married after I had my accident. You know, I was saying to my wife or fiance at the time, you know, you don't have to stay with me, or you shouldn't stay with me. You didn't sign up for this. And then a year and a half later, we were stood at the altar in Italy. So that was an amazing time in my life. And then more recently, all the mountains, getting the charity established. To be honest, you know, I think this is the problem with me. Like, I look at everything positively now. If you'd asked me that question before my accident, I'd have said, I don't know, playing for Bath or something. But now it's like, I think back and just think how lucky I am to have done all of these crazy things. And yeah, life's not easy for me in a lot of ways still. Definitely not as easy as it used to be. But I'm still incredibly lucky compared to so many people, and I'll never forget that.
Well, Ed, on behalf of me and Matt, and for everyone who's listening, thank you so much for giving up your afternoon to come speak to us. It's been really quite inspirational for us, and I hope everyone who's listened really enjoyed it as well. So yeah, thank you very much.
Pleasure, guys. Really enjoyed it.